Welcome to this session on culture, understanding the various types of culture and the terminologies related to culture. In the previous session, we have already talked about what is culture. So, anything that governs our lifestyle, which we try to imitate or we learn from others, our values, our belief systems are part of culture. Now, let's understand how culture progresses from a smaller form to a bigger form. What is the basic difference between popular culture and folk culture? What are the various terminologies associated to culture? So, we'll start with understanding the basic term that is cultural trait. So, the first thing we will be talking about here is the cultural trait. What is cultural trait? Now, cultural trait is any particular feature or any specific thing that is particular to a specific group of people. For example, the type of clothing, or I can say Chinese use chopsticks to eat food. So that is a kind of cultural trait which is common to that is a single feature of the culture. I should say rather it's a single feature of the culture. Then next stage is cultural complex. What is cultural complex? Cultural complex is combination of number of cultural traits. So you have one or more cultural traits that combine to form a cultural complex. A good example of cultural complex is, for example, cattle is considered as a wealth in most of the nations, or in the Maasai society, Maasai tribe in Kenya and Tanzania. So that is a cultural complex. All the people of this tribe would consider cattle as a wealth. Okay? So that is what we understand by cultural complex. Now, when there are a combination of cultural complexes, it leads to what we call as cultural system. That is a particular way in which a culture exists or follows a particular set of behavior. The next is when you have a lot of cultural systems that are combining, we get to form what is known as cultural relief. An example of cultural relief I can say is sub-Saharan Africa. That's a part of Africa that has a common set of culture, and we call this as a cultural relief. So you have combinations of traits known as complexes, then combination of complexes known as systems, and then finally you have combination of systems known as reliefs. Now above all this, there exists what is known as cultural hearth. What is cultural hearth? Cultural hearth is the source of culture or source of any civilization that came into existence. So it's the place from where you have origination of ideas across time and space. For example, you have Indus Valley civilization, that's a cultural hearth. You have Mesopotamian civilization, that's again a cultural hearth. Then you have Nile Valley civilization, that's a cultural hearth. So these are all the places from where you have the origin of idea. Now these are something we are talking about past. Now let's talk about the present day cultural hearth. For example, Makkah Medina is a kind of cultural hearth for Muslims. Whenever we talk about cultural hearth, there is another thing we must know is cultural taboos or cultural barriers. What are cultural barriers or cultural taboos? Barriers are hindrances and so are taboos. So anything that hinders the spread of a culture is known as a cultural barrier. Now a simple way to understand is Hinduism, you say there should be no consumption of beef. So that's a cultural taboo for Hindus. Then for Islam, again the cultural taboo is pork. And similarly for Somalis, the cultural taboo is fishes. So these are the examples where we can understand how the culture restricts or hinders the spread of idea. Now we have talked about cultural barrier and everything. Now let's talk about the next thing that's very important as components of cultural landscape. So any culture has various components. First is art, then you have architecture, then you have the concepts in the culture, the modern, or I could say the contemporary culture. Then you have the traditional landscapes. Okay. Now, when we talk about contemporary architecture, we mainly focus on green energy, recycling of products. Um, so we have green energy technology, recycling. That are the recent issues that are focused these days. Now, in components of culture, there is an important task that is known as land ownership. Now, when we talk about land ownership, there are three types of ownership we usually discuss. It's known as metes and bounds. These are irregular property boundaries, so they do not have a fixed shape. They are irregular in culture, in shape. These were the properties of the aristocratic families. So the previous aristocrat families have the metes and bounds. Then the next is long lots. So you have a piece of land and it has vertical divisions. So that are known as long lots. These is basically subdivision of a land for partial sale. This is common in French colonies and France itself. So French colonies in Quebec, Canada, and Louisiana in USA has a concept of long lots. Then the most common concept of land ownership is rectilinear. That is, you have rectangular plots that are being cut. This is common in USA and Canada, the most popular style of land ownership. Now, these are the various concepts we talk about, components we talk about of cultural landscape. Now, besides that, there are some things we must be very clear about. For any culture, the boundaries are very fuzzy. That means you cannot exactly say from where it ends and where it begins. So the starting point and the end point is not clearly demarcated. For example, I can say this is the map of USA, for example, and this is the boundary for California. So this is a clearly demarcated boundary when we talk about political aspects. But when I talk about cultural aspects, let us take an example of the Mason-Dixie line. So you have the Mason-Dixie line, and now it is south and west of Delaware and north of Maryland. So I cannot exactly mark this is the line. I can say this is a kind of border between two states. But whenever we talk about cultural components and their borders, they are basically fuzzy borders. So you cannot exactly say here this culture ends and here it starts. There must be a point where there is intermingling of the culture. Now, the next thing is whenever we talk about the culture, there are few important things we must know. First is, let's understand the difference between nation and ethnic group. What is an ethnic group and a nation group? So nation group is, we can simply say, population by single culture. So you can say China, you have Chinese culture, Japan, you have Japanese culture. What is ethnic group? Ethnic group is a single identifiable, I could say, a lineage or a heritage. So it's a single with identity which I can find out in a lineage or a heritage. So what is important here is ethnic groups have common social bonds. Okay. Now when we talk about ethnic groups, we try to maintain our identity within the group. So we can say you can have internal groups and then you can have external groups. Now what's the difference? For example, two Jews meet. So they'll talk about Judaism and everything, but that's internal discussion between the Jews. If a Jew meets Buddhist, he would be talking about how Jews behave, and on the other hand, he would be explaining what Buddhists do. Similarly, is if a person from China moves to Africa, he'll try to explain what happens in China. On the other hand, this person would try to explain what happens in Africa. So the intermingling between external groups is a bit different from internal groups. That's why we say within the internal groups, you have the folk culture that's common or native to that group. And with the external groups, you basically rely on the popular culture. Popular culture is, for example, you can find McDonald's everywhere. You can find Pizza Hut globally. So this is something, the things that are becoming global. So these are the popular culture. Now a major drawback in popular culture is loss of identity or loss of uniqueness. So with popular culture, I can say there is a term that is associated and that is known as placelessness. So anything that is related to popular culture would be placeless. You do not know where McD's originated. You do not have any idea where was the first place where Pizza Hut is. But what you know recently is you can find Pizza Hut everywhere. You can find McDonald's everywhere. So that is the concept of placelessness, which is usually associated to popular culture. Okay, now let's understand some of the important terminologies that are used with the cultural concepts. So the first terminology we would be talking about is acculturation. What is acculturation? Acculturation is adopting a culture from a dominant group. So there is a dominant group and there is a subordinate group. So what subordinate group does is it acquires the culture of the dominant group. For example, if I am migrating from say India to US, what would happen is I would try to adopt the culture from US when I am residing in US. So what would be there? What we call the impact of westernization. You would not be wearing the traditional Indian dresses, but what you would move to is the Western or the informal wears. So that is what is acculturation. Now the similar term is there, which is known as assimilation, but there is a difference between these two. Assimilation is intermingling of various cultures, okay, such that the characteristics from various cultures are mixed. So that is what is assimilation. So what you do in the assimilation technically is you try to mix cultures from various groups. For example, you have the ideas from Jews, you have the ideas from Jains, you have the ideas from Christians, then you have the ideas from Islam. And then what you are trying to do, you are trying to include all those ideas into a common place. The best example of assimilation is the restaurants these days. In restaurants, what happen is you can find continental, then you can find Italian, you can find Mexican, and all under one roof in some of the restaurants. So that's what is assimilation. You are trying to include the cultures of various places into one region. Now the next term you must be familiar with is sequent occupancy. Sequent occupants. What is sequent occupants? Sequent occupancy is basically you have it for a single region, but what happens in that region is, for example, this is the territory A. What happens in this territory A is you have different dominant cultures at different time period. So you have along the time, say 1900, you have a different culture, 1950s you have a different culture, and then 2000 you have a different culture. The best example is the colonies that were under British rule. Let's take an example from Nigeria. What happened in Nigeria? Previously they had the traditional local society. When Britishers came in, there was colonial development. When Britishers went off, what happened? The concept changed to globalization. So you can find Pizza Hut, you can find anything out in Nigeria. Other thing is, with time what happens is, Christians came in. The concept was to bring in Christianity and churches was established. So that time it was church, and now it has become a nightclub. So what is happening is, this is an example of sequent occupants. In sequent occupants, what happens is, people have different cultures over the same area through the different time period. So along the time you have sequent occupancy. That is what is understood by this term. So it's a temporal phenomena. And the last important term that we would be talking about today is glocalization. What is glocalization? Globalization is something we understand. It's basically spreading up globally of something. What is glocalization? Localities develop the economic and the cultural aspects. So for example, there is a locality. It develops its economic aspects. It develops its cultural aspects to the global system by means of IT, TV, or by means of traditional power. Now, a good example of glocalization is what is known as Pampered Chef. Pampered Chef was basically they used to teach how to make cooking various types of dishes. Now slowly it is spread very fast in US, and it's now basically everywhere in US, and the basic aim is they teach how to make the cooking easy. So it's something which developed locally, but it is spread out and it developed into a global system. So these are the important terms that we must be familiar with while understanding the concept of culture. So in this lecture, we have talked about culture, the various stages in which the culture grows, the origin base of culture. Then we have talked about the various terminologies associated to culture. In the next session, we will be talking about what is housing and the various types of housing. So we will be discussing more than 30-40 types of housing. So stay tuned for further updates and hope this session was helpful. Have a good day ahead.